Hey, Push Nation. Hi, Push Nation. Today we'll be talking about the New Deal, the Supreme Court, and FDR's court packing.
Push Nation.
Shut up, Greyson! Hey, Push Nation! Today I'm going to be giving you some background information on FDR before we start talking about the New Deal and Supreme Court packing. Alright, let's start with the election of 1932. This was Democrat Franklin Roosevelt versus Republican Herbert Hoover. And Franklin Roosevelt's campaign for bold experimentation in American policy, a New Deal, helped him win. So, while he was in office, American citizens felt a personal connection to their new president because of his masterful use of the radio.
This may be a fun fact. What's the fact? Did you know that Mr. Smith's fireside chats originated from FDR's fireside chats over the radio? That's my fun fact.
During FDR's first 100 days in office, the New Deal addressed 4 major problems in America. Number 1, banking. Number 2, agriculture and manufacturing. Number 3, housing. Number 4, unemployment.
At the beginning of FDR's presidency, the economy was really unstable because of bank failures brought on by bank runs. And bank runs were basically when people were withdrawing their funds in exchange for cash, precious metals, or government bonds. And this created a cycle where as people withdrew more, the banks became more likely to default, causing even more people to withdraw. And then so to stop this, FDR declared a national bank holiday where he closed all the banks, and then he called a special session with Congress where together they created the Emergency Banking Act. And this act led to the creation of the Treasury Department. Secondly, there is the Glass-Steagall Act, which created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insured people's deposits. And lastly, FDR actually took America off of the gold standard. So this allowed the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. The second issue that the New Deal dealt with was in agriculture and manufacturing. Specifically in agriculture, a lot of farmers were struggling because of overproduction, which meant that their crops had really low value. So in order to fix this, there was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and this gave subsidies to farmers who cut down on 7 commodities: corn, cotton, rice, wheat, pigs, tobacco, and dairy. So this increased the value of their crops by decreasing the supply. Then in manufacturing, there is the National Industrial Recovery Act, and this created the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, which set up a bunch of separate self-governing private administrations in over 600 industries. These 2 acts, however, were only temporarily successful, and they didn't actually do much to end the overall Great Depression.
Hey, Push Nation. Okay, I'm going to cover the second half of FDR's first part of the New Deal. So, massive unemployment became Washington's urgent matter when private charities had exhausted their resources and were looking to Washington for assistance. FDR provided relief for millions of unemployed Americans. He persuaded Congress and had a budget for the unemployed. The first step in this process was the Federal Emergency Relief Admissions, FERA. The FERA provided federal funds for the state relief programs. But the New Deal did not just give out money, it gave out public service jobs. With the PWA and the CWA, a construction program, they ended up putting 2.6 million men and women back to work. Thanks, Push Nation. Now, story time with the wonderful children. Next, I will be talking about the housing crisis. Millions of Americans also faced devastation when they were losing their homes. During the Great Depression, economic expansion had produced the largest infantry housing bubble in America. Also, in the early 1930s, as home prices collapsed and banks closed, homeowners were dragged down with them. More than 500,000 Americans lost their home between 1930 and 1932. And in a ton of cities, half of all the homes were foreclosed. But in response to this, Congress created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the HOLC. to refinance home mortgages. The HOLC helped more than 1 million Americans retain their homes. Also, the Federal Housing Act of 1934 would extend this program under a new agency, the Federal Housing Administration, FHA. Together, the HOLC and the FHA helped with the Housing Act of 1937 and permanently changed the housing system, setting the foundations for the broad expansion of home ownership.
Hey guys, so I'm just going to talk real quickly about the Second New Deal. So the Second New Deal emphasized social justice, and it included programs to redistribute wealth and power in favor of the poor, the elderly, the farmers, and union workers. So there were a few main acts that you should probably know when talking about the Second New Deal. These acts were the Social Security Act of 1935, the Wagner Act, the Banking Act of 1935, and the Rural Electrification Act of 1936. So just going in order, the Social Security Act of 1935 included 3 main benefits for Americans, the first of which was old age pensions for workers. The second was a joint federal-state system of compensation for unemployed workers. And lastly, the third was a program of payments to widowed mothers, blind people, deaf people, and other disabled people. So going on next, the Wagner Act upheld the right of workers to form unions. After the Supreme Court voided the NIRA, which had previously granted them this right, the Wagner Act also established the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB, which was a federal agency that protected workers from employer coercion. So essentially, it protected them from employers trying to get them to lie in the case of scandals or anything like that. So next, the Electrification Act provided federal loans for the installation of electricity distribution systems for poor rural areas in the United States. And lastly, the Banking Act of 1935, what that did was it extended the deadline set by the Banking Act of 1933, which required all banks to become part of the Federal Reserve System. So the Second New Deal also gave rise to what is called New Deal liberalism, which is basically where the divide between modern conservatives and liberals first became very apparent. The liberals being people who were in favor of the New Deal, in favor of strong central government that provided basic welfare to citizens and pensions to needy and disabled people, and of course the conservatives being people who are in favor of weak centralized government that is more of the laissez-faire system, which gives more power in the hands of the people, like we had previous years to FDR's presidency. So, thanks. Hey guys, so the effects of the New Deal on society. So the Wagner Act created a massive surge of importance for labor unions. A new group known as the Congress of Industrial Organizations rose into prominence. They wanted what was called industrial unionism, where they basically wanted all workers, regardless of skill or trade, organized into one union. And also the AFL became more powerful during this time as well. So let's talk about women now. The New Deal did not directly address gender inequality, but there were a few important advancements, such as the first woman to serve as a cabinet member, Frances Perkins. She was during FDR's presidency, but a most important woman during FDR's presidency was possibly Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife. She pushed very hard to expand positions for women in all areas of society. She worked very closely with African Americans to help push for anti-lynching laws, and she was a very important mind behind the progressivism during FDR's presidency. So next, African Americans. FDR established the Resettlement Administration in 1935, which helped protect the rights of black tenant farmers. Also, the feeling that the government cared about them, which was caused the African Americans to switch from Republican, which they had been since what's the guy's name? Abraham Lincoln's presidency back in the 1800s, and up until now they were always Republican. But since FDR's presidency and the New Deal and all the new programs that he instilled, that he created, they joined the Democrat side. So also, Roosevelt also had an informal group of African Americans called his Black Cabinet, and they were a group of intellectual African Americans who helped advise him on New Deal policies. One of the most prolific was Mary Bethune, who was a very prolific speaker about women's rights and African American rights during this time, as she was African American. That was basically the extent of new rights for African Americans, though, because FDR had to keep support from Southern white Democrats, and if he pushed too hard for things such as anti-lynching laws, he would have lost their support, and he couldn't afford to do that. Also, the Social Security and Wagner Act excluded domestic workers and farmers, which the majority of African Americans were in these trades during this time, so they didn't get a lot of benefits from of some of the new acts. Lastly, Native Americans. A man by the name of John Collier, so like Border Collie but with an R, he was the commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He helped pass the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which revoked the Severalty Act of 1887, which had previously divided Native American reservations into individual plots and then giving them to different Native Americans. Basically like a Native American version of the Homestead Act. The Indian Reorganization Act also promoted Indian self-government, and it led to natives being had greater religious freedom like they had in previous years, and also more independence, and they didn't have to rely so much on the American government. So thanks.
Hey, Push Nation! We're gonna talk about the feud between FDR and the Supreme Court.
So the Supreme Court struck down almost all of FDR's New Deal policies, and this is because the majority of the Supreme Court justices were actually conservative, and so they voted conservatively against him. There were 4 specific justices who were known as the Four Horsemen, and they were Pierce Butler, James McReynolds, George Sutherland, and Willis Van Devanter. And although that's only 4, there was also a 5th justice who was considered a swing vote. His name was Owen Roberts, and he also voted conservatively with the Four Horsemen to make a conservative majority in the Supreme Court. Okay, the feud between FDR and the Supreme Court is often sensationalized by media coverage, and in fact, a lot of the American citizens also had their own criticisms about the Supreme Court, especially with decisions such as in the Tipaldo case, where they struck down a New York law providing minimum wage for children and women. This case also allowed Joe Tipaldo to continue exploiting his female workers in his Brooklyn sweatshop.
The Supreme Court struck down a lot of FDR's policies, like when they declared the National Recovery Administration unconstitutional in Cheshire v. United States, and also when they struck down the Agricultural Administration Act, or the AAA. And because so many of Franklin Roosevelt's efforts were being undone, he devised a plan to get the courts to rule in his favor, called court packing.
Hey friends, I'm here to tell you about FDR and court packing. This was about Franklin Roosevelt trying to get more judges on the Supreme Court so he can get his New Deal agenda going. So a lot of his first New Deal policies were struck down, and so Franklin Roosevelt was kind of angry about that. So to prevent the same thing from happening to the second New Deal policies, he had the Judicial Reorganization Bill drafted, which proposed to add a new justice to the Supreme Court for every member over 70 years old. And he tried to get 6 new justices and more than 40 federal judges. But he was accused of trying to pack the court by his enemies, and that he was trying to get too much power, so that was bad, and the bill didn't pass in the end. But you know, that was okay, because a lot of justices just kind of conveniently retired soon after this, so Franklin Roosevelt was able to get all his favorite liberal justices he wanted on the Supreme Court anyway, and much of his New Deal policies, like the Wagner and Social Security Acts, were upheld by the court, so it's not that bad, guys.
There's no